So, with the spoiler season behind us now that all the cards have been revealed for D&D Forgotten Realms, in today's video we diving into some previews of some cards I think stood out to me when I kind of went through the list and kind of saw and kind of looked through the cards and kind of, I thought about the cards and kind of figured out whether or not, these are some cards I would play, whether they are cards that are going to be good or whether they're going to be cards that I do feel like kind of give that D&D experience to the game of Magic the Gathering. I will also have a preview up of the card as I talk. It'll probably be on my left-hand side that you kind of will see on screen. So if you want to read the card along as I kind of talk about it, kind of figure out what your opinion is, as well as if there's any cards I don't go over in today's video, leave them down in the comments below. I do want to see what cards you guys are excited about when it comes to this set as a whole, as I do feel like a lot of people are excited for new things for Standard. Not just in Arena, but I guess in physical Magic. I know the meta is a bit stale, and I don't think we're going to get a true reset and kind of really feel the impact of where Standard's going until September as a whole. But I do think in these D&D inspired cards are definitely going to be a little bit of breath of fresh air for the game as a whole. But if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely lets me know you guys like these style of videos. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. It puts a +1+1 counter on the channel and lets you know when I post new videos here. And with that being said, let's just dive in the video and let's just talk about it. So the first color we're going to be going over is white, and I'm going to be doing these in different timestamp and groupings by color. So if you want to jump ahead, depending on what you're looking for to kind of get my feedback on a few cards, you can do so down below. But we're going to be starting off with white, and they're going to be going down in some sort of order. So the first card up is going to be Portable Hole. Now, Portable Hole, I do think is going to be an interesting card here. I do think it's a pretty decent overall card for its value. You only pay 1 mana for an artifact that when it enters the battlefield, you get to exile target non-land permanent opponent controls with a converting mana cost 2 or less until it leaves the hole. So I do think this is going to be a card that's going to replace Glass Casket in a way, and I do like it that it's a card that will hit other things than just, creatures for the most part. And I mean, I guess the drawback is that it's going to only be 2 or less, but I do think because it is an uncommon, I do see the reason why they decided to only make it 2 or less. If they made it any higher, it'd probably be a rare and or mythic, depending on how good it would be. But I do think it hits a lot of things in the early game, kind of gets rid of tokens if there's any tokens out in the battlefield, as I do think that could be something that could see some play in Arena and or Standard go forward in the set. But with that being said, let's move on to the next card and let's just talk about it. So the next card up is another interesting one. It's a 1-drop. It's a 1 mana, 1/1 Monk of the Open Hand. It has this ability called Flurry of the Bows, kind of giving that little bit of flavor of it being a monk. And essentially the ability is whenever we cast our second spell each turn, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Monk of the Open Hand. Kind of like it's like a weird Clarion Spirit before making a creature bigger. And I do think it's going to be kind of interesting to kind of team that up with something like a Clarion Spirit and get more second spell triggers. I do think there's some other cards that have this kind of effect. So it's going to be kind of cool to see what kind of deck you can make out of this. But this is definitely one that I could see, take place in some sort of white weenie style deck that's playing multiple spells that cost on the cheap, or maybe splice it into that kind of Magecraft style deck. This card could overall see some pretty decent play. I do think this value of a 1 mana 1/1 could, put your opponent in a weird position, because let's just say turn 1 you play this, turn 2 you play your spell, it becomes it's still a 1/1, then you play your second spell that if it costs 1, and then all of a sudden this thing's a 2/2 and you're swinging in for 2. So overall, pretty decent card. I do think it's one of those cards that benefits if you're on the play rather than you're on the draw, just because you definitely want to get this thing bigger and out of range of damage in that way. But overall, pretty good card. Just pretty interesting. Also, it's an elf, so I don't know if there's a lot of elves that are white, but it could be something you could splice into an elf deck if that's something you're also looking to play. Now, the next card up is Dwarfhold Champion. It's a 2 mana 3/1. It's a common card. The common cards for white weren't as impressive that I really could figure out which one I kind of liked, but I thought this one was pretty interesting. It's showing that they are adding more dwarves to the Standard meta, and it is something that benefits from being in a deck that plays a lot of equipments, as it is only a 3/1 for 2 mana, which already makes it pretty decently aggressive. It doesn't have indestructible or anything, but the benefit here is that if it's equipped, it also gets +0/+2. So essentially, for attaching equipment to it, becomes a 3/3 plus whatever the equipment does. So I do think this card could be, see some pretty decent play in maybe some sort of Boros style dwarf deck. I do have a dwarf deck I did kind of do, so maybe this is a card I will add to it, especially because it's equipment heavy style deck. So I do think that this could see some sort of fit, especially with some of the dwarves that may rotate out from the older sets, like like the Seven Dwarves and also Rimrock Knight. So this is definitely something that could see some play in some sort of style dwarf deck tribal. Though overall, outside of that, if you're not playing any equipments, it's still a pretty decent 3/1 for 2 mana. So you can attack him pretty aggressively, or your opponent kind of has to deal with it. Now the last card up is another interesting one. It's Nadar, Selfless Paladin. It's a 3 mana 3/3 that has Vigilance, which is pretty decent, so it doesn't have to tap to attack. And whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you get to venture into a dungeon, which is that new mechanic that they introduced. I did go over the venture mechanic overall, but essentially we get to put a dungeon into play and or go deeper into our dungeon to, get some sort of effect. And the other thing that's pretty cool about it is that other creatures we control get +1/+1 as long as we have completed a dungeon. So as long as you can either keep him out on the battlefield in the early game to go through a dungeon and or complete one by the time he comes out into the battlefield. It has this kind of anthem effect that's going to make your creature stronger, and it's kind of cool that it is also a Dragon Knight. I don't know if it's because they call him Dragon Knight because of his dragon style armor, or if he's really a dragon underneath that armor. But overall, pretty decent card that I do think could be in some sort of venture style deck, or maybe some deck that's being a little bit more on the aggressive side and just wants a solid 3 mana 3/3 for 3. Now, the next color we're going to go into is a blue, and the first card we have up is an equipment card, so it's a pretty interesting card. What it does, it's called Trickster's Talisman. It's a 1 mana equipment that has this ability called Invoke Duplicity. An equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has an ability that whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice the token. If we do, we could create a creature token that is a copy of this creature. So essentially, it has this ability that if our opponent decides to let our creature get in through for some damage, and maybe it's a card that has, some sort of other trigger that when it comes into the battlefield, we will be able to sacrifice this token and get another copy of that card to then re-trigger another effect, which is definitely a pretty interesting card. And for it being a 1 mana card that has this ability, it could make it very good in the style of decks that are looking to maybe copy some spells, get some additional enter the battlefield triggers. And it's a 1 mana and equipped for 2. Overall, pretty decent. And given a creature +1/+1 isn't that bad overall. And it's something I could see some play in some various decks that are trying to do this kind of duplication type of thing. Now, the next card up is another card that's another interesting kind of venture card, but it's a card called Fly. Essentially, all it does is it does what it says. It gives your enchanted creature has flying, so it's an aura. And then whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to venture into a dungeon. So I do think this is kind of like one of those kind of tempo plays. Um, and what it's trying to do is the creature now has flying, so it kind of gets over ground creatures, and that as long as this creature is dealing damage to our opponent, we're going to be going through a dungeon, we're going to be getting those additional triggers, which is definitely going to be very beneficial to us as the player, because if you've looked at the various dungeons, there's some that help us draw cards, some of them help us scry and maybe look for answers if we need to answer something that's on the board. But overall, pretty interesting card for 1 mana, and I do think this is something that is going to also be beneficial to decks that are looking to play those venture style of dungeons and things like that. So definitely a good card to maybe look out for if this is something you're looking to get into, if you're especially wanting to venture into some dungeons and complete them. And now the next card up is another interesting card here. It's a common. It's a 1 mana common, which is another very interesting card in the sense that it's an artifact creature that's a bird. It's a silver raven, and it has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry 1. So I unsure where it's going to fit, if it's going to fit anywhere, but a 1 mana 1/1 flyer that allows you to scry is not too bad. I don't know if there's going to be like an artifact deck per se that's going to need this card in it, but I do think it could be something if you're more on a budget and you're looking for some maybe aggressive creatures, that a 1 mana flyer that allows you to scry and set up your next turn could be pretty decent. Other than that, it was just something that out of all the commons that were in the set, I do think this is something that I think stood out to me just because of its ability for how much it costs. It could overall be pretty decent. And now the last card up of the blue is Dragon Turtle. It's a 3 mana 3/5 that has flash. And then when its ability is when it enters the battlefield, tap it and up to 1 target creature an opponent controls, and they don't untap during their controller's next untap steps. So essentially, this is kind of one of those things that's kind of interesting, to be honest. It's a creature that comes in the battlefield. You can play it on your turn and tap a creature an opponent controls, and this pretty much allows that creature not to untap during your opponent's next turn, and then this will untap your following turn. So that is one way to play it, and I guess at worst you can always play it as the flash spell that it is, and tap that target creature on that particular turn, and then this doesn't untap during your following turn, and then your opponent's creature then untaps, so it kind of like slows down your opponent. So I do see why that is kind of like a drawback to the card, but it being a 3/5 for 3 mana isn't that terrible, and it makes a pretty decent blocker that you can always flash in if you really need to, or best case scenario, you just play it on turn 3 maybe and just get a decent blocker in your opponent's way and tap something down in that process. So overall, pretty interesting card here. I don't really know where it really falls into like how good it really is. But I kind of just like it because it's a dragon turtle. It's literally a dragon turtle. So I do like it in that sense that it's kind of like this thing that doesn't make really any sense, but overall pretty interesting card nonetheless. Now moving into black, black is actually pretty interesting for Forgotten Realms, just in what some of the cards do. And there's some of the things I do think they're trying to introduce that are things that are definitely are feel very black swamp kind of style decks would play. And this is kind of one of them. It's called Devour Intellect. It's a 1 mana sorcery spell that target discards a card. If mana was played from a treasure was spent to cast this spell. So if you spend a treasure to cast this spell, you get to instead have that opponent reveal their hand. You get to choose a non-land card from it, and that player discards that card. So it's an interesting card that has two different effects based on how you spend what mana you spent to actually cast the spell. Either one, it's a 1 mana discard spell, or two, it's a make a treasure, play this from treasure mana, and then make your opponent discard a non-land card. So it's like it has a plus if you actually do create some treasures. So it's gonna be definitely kind of interesting if there's gonna be ways to create a lot of treasures to kind of get these additional effects. And I do think there's some more in the black card pool, and I do think there's some in other colors as well, but I do think this is a pretty decent card for the value that it is. It's a 1 mana discard spell at worst, and it's a 1 mana discard make your opponent discard any non-land card if you play it with treasure mana. So overall pretty decent card for just being a common. The next card up is another common card. It's called Feign Death. It's a 1 mana instant spell that until end of turn, target creature gains 1. This creature dies, return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So essentially, it's kind of like some of the cards that we've seen in standard that would prevent your creature from completely dying. The one drawback is that it does come back into the battlefield tapped, but the benefit of that is it does come back on the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. So it is one of those things that has a minus and a plus. And I do think for 1 mana, it's overall not too bad. I mean, most cases, black cards like this, typically make you pay some sort of life. And in this, the only downfall to it is that the creature comes into play tap. So I do think this could be something in like those decks that are trying to save creatures from going to graveyards and maybe just re-trigger them coming back on the battlefield and getting a little bit of benefit out of it. The next card up is Lightfoot Rogue. It's a 2 mana 2/1. It's already pretty decent for its value. And I do think that the thing I really enjoy about it is its sneak attack ability, that whenever it attacks, we get to roll d20. And essentially what is going to happen is our rogue is going to get death touch depending on what we roll. And it only gets better the higher we roll overall. So at first, if we roll 1 through 9, it just gets death touch in a turn. 10 through 19, it gets +1/+0 and gains death touch, so it becomes a 3/1 with death touch, which becomes a decent threat. And if we roll a natural 20, it gets +3/+0, it gains first strike and death touch on a turn, so it becomes some big massive threat your opponent really has to deal with for only 2 mana. So I do think it's randomized how good it's going to be, just because you have to roll a dice to kind of really figure it out. But at the end of the day, it's still a 2/1 death toucher, which overall makes it a pretty decent value, and makes it very challenging if your opponent's going to want to block it early as they're still trying to set their board up. It's something that can definitely attack him pretty aggressively and hit your opponent for a decent chunk of damage. Sure, you're not going to be attacking for 5 life each turn, but if you do get lucky and roll 20 here and there, it definitely could hit for a pretty decent chunk. So overall, pretty decent card for its value. And now the next card up is another spell that I do think is going to become kind of like the Heartless Axe / Eliminate slot in Magic, and depending on how the meta shifts, it is a card that's going to definitely see some play just because of its value, and that's Power Word Kill. It's a 2 mana instant spell that destroys target non-angel, non-demon, non-devil, non-dragon creature, so essentially hits a pretty decent chunk of creatures that exist in the meta, though, the one downfall is with, Kaldheim and Strixhaven, and I do think, with the Forgotten Realms, we do see a lot more dragons that we'll see play. And there's some angels out there as well. I'm not sure about the demons and devils part, but a 2 mana removal spell that with its only drawback being that is overall not too bad, because there is a lot of things that it is going to hit, and if your opponent is playing those creatures, it's one of those things you'd eventually sideboard out. But overall, pretty good card that we're definitely going to see some play with, just because it's going to replace that 2 mana removal slot that we are losing come September. And now the last card up, just because I know black has one additional card, but I figured I'd just throw in the removal spell that was going to be something that we'll see throughout play, and that is Vorpal Sword. It's just one of those cool cards that is kind of like, that great item if you've ever played D&D, that is just cool with the effect it's going to do. Now, sure, it doesn't exactly do the Vorpal effect until you, I guess, pay the 8 mana, but the idea here, it's a 1 mana equipment that costs 1 black. Equipped creature has +2/+0 and has death touch, so essentially you can give death touch to any one of your creatures, give it also 2 power. And the equip cost is only 2 double black, so you probably want to play this in a mono black deck, or in some sort of deck that you can fix your mana, so you can always have 2 black mana open. But the cool idea here is in the late game, if our opponent really doesn't have anything going on and we can kind of get this in, we can actually play it, equip it, and then possibly have 8 mana open. Until end of turn, Vorpal Sword gains whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. So it has a built-in effect that it can just one swing as if your opponent has no way to deal with it. You can just make your opponent lose the game if they have, no way to prevent the damage being dealt to them. So overall, pretty interesting card nonetheless. I mean, an equipment that gives a creature death touch and +2/+0 is not too bad because your opponent's not really going to want to block into it, just because their creature's going to die regardless of how big it is. But overall, pretty cool card just because of its, D&D kind of lore synergy that kind of goes on with that. All right, so the next color up is red, and red is actually pretty interesting because I do kind of like what they're doing with red, and it is, like, for the most part, you'll kind of notice in a lot of the cards I selected, there's a lot more goblins that they've introduced with the Forgotten Realms, and it's something I really do like. I do like goblin-style decks. Goblins are pretty cool tribal overall, and some of the cards that are coming out are definitely helping maybe to build that goblin-style tribal deck be a thing. So let's see kind of how it works out. I know there's a lot more goblins that will be in standard up until September, so it's going to be kind of cool to kind of mess around with, like, seeing what kind of goblin deck we can build with those. But it's going to be also interesting if they're going to be introducing any more goblins in the future to kind of hopefully maybe build up this kind of style of tribal deck to hopefully keep it around post-September. But the first card up is Goblin Javelineer. It's a 1-mana 1/1 with haste, and when it becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to target creature blocking it. So this is actually before damage, and in their early game, this is actually fairly pretty good because the idea here is, you swing in aggressively, your opponent may have a blocker, and if they decide to block, regardless of it having 2 toughness, this is already going to do 1 damage to that creature that's going to be blocking it. So the creature is going to more than likely die even from it getting hit only for 1. So it's going to make your opponent want to just, eat some damage at the early game because they're not going to block anything to it, even because they don't want that creature dying in the process of being blocked by it unless they are able to pump up that creature and prevent it from being dying by being dealt that 1 damage. So overall, pretty interesting creature that kind of, feels very goblin, let's go all in kind of thing. So definitely a pretty cool card overall. So this next card up is another interesting instant spell. It's a 3-mana instant that we get to choose one. We get to call Charge Them, which essentially gives all our creatures that we control +2/+0 into end of turn, or we can befriend them, which essentially create 2 1/1 goblin red creature tokens at instant speed, which is definitely pretty cool depending on what our opponent's doing. We can either do this at the end of our opponent's turn if we want to get some threats on the board to maybe swing in aggressively the following turn, or if we swing in and our opponent doesn't really block, we can give all our creatures we control +2/+0 into end of turn. So just swinging them very, very aggressively could catch our opponent off guard, especially in a goblin deck that can produce a lot of tokens. This could definitely be a card that can definitely hit them by surprise, and they may not know how to deal with it, and they may scoop right then and there. Now, the next card up is Burning Hands, and I do think this is one of those cards that are fairly interesting, and there's other cards like this in other colors that do various things depending on what color it is, and Burning Hands is pretty interesting. It's a 2-mana spell that deals 2 damage to target creature, which is not too bad, but it has the plus benefit that if that creature is green, it actually deals 6 damage instead, which is actually pretty good, and I do think this is going to be something you more than likely see in a sideboard just because of that additional +6. But I mean, overall for 2 mana, I mean, it's not a bad removal spell. Now, the next card up is Hobgoblin Bandit Lord. It's a 3-mana 2/3. It's pretty much essentially our Goblin Lord. It's going to make all our other goblins we control get additional +1/+1. And it also has this other ability that we can tap it for 1 red, and we can actually make it deal damage equal to its number of goblins that enter the battlefield under our control this turn to any target. So essentially it has a built-in, hey, let's just say 2 goblins came into the battlefield, we can ping our opponent or ping an opponent creature for 2 damage, which is not bad, especially if we have spells that can produce tokens. We have spells that, are on the cheaper side that we can, spam out a few on a turn and, just get some additional damage. So overall, pretty interesting card, and I do think this is setting up for goblins to be maybe some sort of tribal deck that you may see some play, or it may just be one of those tribal decks that kind of pop up, kind of do okay, but are nothing too great. So we'll kind of wait and see really where this actually goes from here. Now, the next color up is green, and this one the first card up is going to be Intrepid Outlander. It's a 2-mana 2/3 with Reach, and it has this ability called Pack Tactics, which I kind of briefly went over, but it's a pretty cool flavor that's on a lot of these like green or red cards, that essentially if you attack in and the combined power of the creatures you're attacking in with are 6 or more, it does some sort of ability, and this one actually allows you to venture into a dungeon, which is something that's definitely pretty awesome, in the sense that, the venture mechanic could be something that could see some play. I don't really know how powerful it really is. I do think they kind of, nerf the dungeons a little bit so they're not too broken. That's something that everyone's gonna want to do, but I do think they're okay if you do decide to play some dungeons. But the idea here is that whenever you attack in aggressively, at least with power 6 or more, you're gonna at least get one venture trigger out of it, which is definitely pretty good. And the idea for 2 mana and getting a 2/3 with reach, it definitely makes a pretty decent blocker that you can just kind of hold back and kind of slow down your opponent if your opponent's playing something a little bit more on the aggressive side. But maybe that's something that's not as powerful. 3 toughness is definitely pretty tough to get through, especially in the early game, which I do think is what they're trying to set up, is trying to get through that early game and kind of go for that more mid-range style game. And this is definitely a card to get you there. And it's pretty cool that it is an Orc Ranger overall, and it has some kind of cool flavor that kind of feels very D&D like. The next card up is another card, which is actually pretty interesting here just because of its multiple abilities, so it has some sort of value depending on what you're trying to do with it. And it's a 2 mana and you find a Cursed Idol, and essentially this is a card that either has 3 different abilities you get to choose when you cast it. One, you can destroy target artifact. 2, you can actually call it Smash Hit. You can either lift the curse, which you get to destroy target enchantment, which essentially, if you destroy the enchantment, you're going to be lifting the curse of that particular idol. And then 3, Steal Its Eyes. You can create a treasure token and venture into a dungeon. So for 2 mana, we can get additional mana, which is a little bit awesome in green, where you get that additional ramp, and at the same time too, we can start a dungeon, exploring. So depending on the situation, you can do one of the 3 things, and just even venture into a dungeon, getting a trigger and getting a token out of it that you can, spend it as mana in the next turn is definitely going to be something that could be pretty decent, depending on how aggressively you want to go into that whole venture mechanic. So overall, pretty good card that has some decent value depending on situation. Now, the next card up on the list is actually going to be Wild Shape. This is another interesting card here, and what it does, it has this ability, yet again, just like some of the other cards, that you can choose, a particular effect depending on what you want to spend. And for 1 mana, it having these various abilities, depending on what the situation is, could become pretty useful. So essentially, choose until 1 turn, target creature we control has the base power and toughness, becomes that creature type, and gains the ability. So it can become a 1/3 turtle with hexproof, which is pretty good if your opponent's trying to target it with some sort of removal or some sort of damage. It can also become a 1/5 spider if you need to block something that's trying to fly through the air, all with reach. And it also become a 3/3 elephant with trample, which in the end, if you're trying to maybe finish off the opponent, giving a creature base power and toughness of 3/3 is definitely pretty good. And combine any of these with some +1/+1 counters that could happen in a green style deck. This is something that can definitely get in for some decent damage and or prevent a decent amount of damage with this ability. And maybe this is one of those cards that if you're playing that, maybe like some sort of deck that likes to play some spells with some pumps, this is definitely something, depending on the situation, you can always have in your back pocket just in case your opponent's maybe trying to attack aggressively on you, and something that you can also maybe try to catch them by surprise and they'd be like, holy crap, I just attacked into a 1/5 spider. Now that could be a 3/6 spider or 3/7 spider. Their damage doesn't go through. So overall, pretty interesting card, and I do think it could see some play just because of its unique kind of style to kind of shape the creature depending on how you want to, prevent and or do damage to your opponent. Now, this last card up in green is actually another interesting one. It's a 5 mana 4/4 Trample Haster. It's called Froghemoth. It's a Trample Haster for 5 mana. That's a 4/4. When it deals combat damage to a player, you get to exile up to that many target cards from their graveyard. Put a +1/+1 counter on each on Froghemoth for each creature re-exiled this way, and you gain 1 life for each non-creature re-exiled this way. So overall, it's a pretty interesting card in the sense that it can either remove creatures to become bigger. It can also remove non-creatures to become, gain you some life. So in a way, it becomes kind of that replacement for Ooze. And the benefit here is all we have to do is attack in, and we get to eat some things in our opponent's graveyard. In the current meta, with the way we have things that are escaping out and things that maybe your opponent wants to return, it's definitely become a card that can definitely eat some cards from a graveyard and actually attack in to do so. So it's definitely very good, and also has haste, so it can attack in the turn that it's played. So it's definitely something that your opponent may not be ready for, expecting that a turn 5 4/4 haste that's now going to eat their graveyard up. It's definitely going to be kind of interesting to see in the current meta, let alone in possibly the rotation meta. Also in the rotation, it could become that decent 5/5, that decent 5-drop that can definitely, chunk down some of your opponent's, graveyard, and also become bigger in the process, and just become that pesky threat that you're gonna have to deal with. Also, at the same time too, I do like this card art. It's a frog horror, so it's part frog, part horror. So it is kind of like a cool combination of some two things that really don't make any sense combined together. So overall, pretty cool card nonetheless. Now, the next style of cards are like the multicolor cards, and this is kind of where we have a lot of legendaries. So, depending on what style of deck you are in your multicolor slot in Forgotten Realms, this is where you're going to find a lot of cards that kind of synergize, two different colors together to kind of do some sort of thing. And the first card we have up is Nar, Demon of the Fangno. It's a 2 mana, 2/2, one red and a green. It has the ability called Pack Tactics, and whenever it attacks, if you attack with creatures with a total power of 6 or greater, are attacking creatures we control get +1/+0, so they become even more aggressive. So you may be attacking for 6, and now essentially we are attacking 4 creatures for 6. Now we're attacking 4 creatures for 10 because we get that additional +1/+0 out of it. At the same time, too, we can always tap 4 mana. We can double its power and toughness at the end of turn, so make it a 2/2 into a 4/4, and then attack in, and then we just need one creature with two power to attack in with it. And now we're going to be getting that additional +1/+0, which has definitely become very beneficial. The other thing too is being able to tap it for that additional 4 after maybe the trigger goes off, and maybe getting that additional +1 power, so it becomes a 3/2, and then now it's actually a 6/4. Could become even better depending on the situation, if depending on how aggressive you really want to get. Overall, it's a pretty cool card for a deck that's trying to attack in very aggressively. Maybe take advantage of this Pack Tactics ability to just kind of get that extra damage and maybe get a win that way. Next card up in this is Hamar Pashar, the Rune Seeker. It's a 3 mana 2/3, and room abilities of dungeons you own trigger an additional time. So this is gonna be kind of interesting. This is an Azoria style card that would probably more than likely be like in a control style deck, but getting the double abilities of things that happen in dungeons could be very beneficial to you in the sense that maybe there's one that makes you scry, but now you scry instead of scry 1, you scry 2, because you scry once and then you scry once again. Or if you draw a card, now you draw 2 cards. It's definitely going to be kind of one of those things to see how strong Venture is going to be, and if this is going to be something Venture multiple times in the same room is definitely going to be pretty interesting to see how much of a benefit you get. Because I do think every time you venture and kind of go into a different part of the room and get some sort of ability that is like a value there, and then being able to trigger that additional time is definitely gonna be even double the value, which is definitely pretty cool. The next card up is something that I know a lot of people are gonna be kind of like, it's Cradle of Baldur's Gate. It's a 2 mana 1/3 rogue. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses 1 life, mills a card, then you gain 1 life, and we get to scry 1. And whenever we attack, we may pay 2. If we do, target creature can't be blocked this turn. So essentially, you can pay additional 2 and make this creature not be able to be blocked, get all these abilities, and essentially do all those effects to your opponent. Or if there's something that may be bigger that you want to get in for some damage, you can actually pay the 2, regardless if this attacks or not, and actually make that creature not be able to be blocked if you want to get in some other damage from another source. But overall, a pretty interesting card. It is also legendary, so your opponent's not going to be able to play multiples of them. But in a way, this is maybe where Rogues kind of shifts to, kind of into this more maybe aggressive style deck that kind of, tries to do this elusive damage that your opponent can't block or prevent. So overall, pretty interesting card here. Not a card that maybe a lot of people want to see because it is a rogue, but overall, pretty cool card regardless. Now, this last card up is actually a card that doesn't actually seem to be amazing, but it seems to be pretty interesting on what it's trying to do. It's Minsk, the Beloved Ranger. It's a 3 mana 3/3 Ranger. When it enters the battlefield, we get to create Boo, a legendary 1/1 red hamster token with trample and haste. Uh, I mean, to be quite honest, I actually select this card because who doesn't want to create a 1/1 hamster token that's named Boo? And the other ability here is we can tap X until end of turn. Target creature we control becomes base power and toughness equal to X, and is a giant in addition to its other types. Activate only as a sorcery. So essentially, it's creating a creature that we can always tap X for and make it into a much bigger creature. Essentially, making Boo possibly bigger, making it base power and toughness of 3/3 4/4, depending on how much open mana we have. Like I said, I don't really know how great it's going to be because Boo on its own is not amazing because it's only a 1/1, so it's definitely something your opponent can pick off. But overall, having the ability to just pump up creatures and make them even bigger, just tap in X mana that you may just have left over, could be also something that could catch your opponent by surprise, and you get in for that additional damage. And now, finally, for like the various groups here, we have artifacts. And the first card up, we have Bag of Holding. It's an interesting card here, in the sense that it is very magic lore heavy. But whenever we discard a card, we get to exile a card from our graveyard. So essentially, every time we discard, we exile a card in the graveyard. If the card we discard is the only card in our graveyard, we get to exile that card. But we can tap 2, tap it. We get to draw a card and discard a card. We can tap 4, tap it. We can sacrifice Bag of Holding and return all exiled cards with Bag of Holding to their owner's hands. So essentially, we get to possibly replay our spells multiple times, which could be very good in the late game, especially if we're playing a lot of things in the early game. We want to get them back, redo them all over again. Maybe we played a board wipe, but we want to get the board wipe back. We can tap 4, get it back by this way. The one downfall is you do have to draw and discard a card. So, you may have to discard a card to then eventually get back, your board wipe spell that you may have cast already once. But overall, pretty decent card for 1 mana. It could be pretty good. I could see it more being a limited card, but overall, it's a pretty cool card that has a lot of D&D lore to it, just because it is something that is very D&D lore heavy. And the other artifact that we have here that is kind of very, very D&D heavy is the Deck of Many Things. It's a 5-mana legendary artifact that we can tap it. We get to roll a d20 and subtract the number of cards we have in our hand. If that result is 0 or less, discard our hand. But the cool thing about this card is that if we roll 1 through 9, return a card at random from our graveyard to our hand. So we can return any card back from our graveyard to our hand. If we roll in that 20, we get to put a creature card from any graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. When that creature dies, its owner loses the game. So essentially, what you could do here is you can set your opponent up by putting one of their creatures back on the battlefield under their control. And now that, if you have some sort of removal, you now make your opponent, you can kill that creature off, and now your opponent loses the game. Now, I don't really know how often this is going to happen, but it is one of those things that could be kind of cool to kind of set your opponent up for maybe that big fail. And I actually kind of missed 10 through 19. You get to draw 2 cards. So overall, pretty interesting card here that has a lot of drawbacks because you have to subtract your hand size. So I don't think if you roll a nat 20, you have to have 0 cards in hand and roll a nat 20 really to get the last effect. But overall, pretty interesting if you can roll 10 through 19 pretty consistently. Yet again, it's, I think, a fun card. I really don't think it's going to see a lot of play just because discarding your hand is not a very great thing. But if you're empty-handed, it could be a card that could be beneficial to you in one way or another. So overall, pretty interesting card. Not really much more to say on that. So the last thing I wanted to kind of do a spotlight on is kind of some cards I find interesting just overall. And the first cards I want to talk about are actually the creature lands. And now there's one for each color, and they're mono colors, so we're not going to get dual creature lands. So we're not getting any sort of splash mana in this set, but we're getting some lands that are going to come into the battlefield. If we control 2 or more other lands, Layer of the Hope enters the battlefield tap. So these are lands that do come in the battlefield in the late game tap, but in the early game they do produce green mana, white mana, blue mana, red mana, black mana, so on and so forth. And essentially, they produce green mana, or we have some sort of ability like in the one for Layer of the Hydra, we can tap X and a green until end of turn. Layer of the Hydra becomes XX green Hydra creature. It's still a land, and X can't be 0, so you can't cast it for 0. Create a land that's just going to die immediately. You can always cast it if you're just kind of drawing a bunch of lands. You can make your land a big creature, swinging for a lot of damage. Your opponent can't do anything to deal with it. You're going to hit for a lot of damage that your opponent now has to kind of think about. Do I want to, deal with that creature land, or do I want to just kind of, block it or whatever? But overall, pretty cool ability. And each color has their own kind of flavor. For example, white has, we can tap 5 mana. The land becomes a 3/4 white dragon creature token with flying to end of turn. It's still a land for 5 mana, which is not bad. Red has, until end of turn, it becomes a goblin creature with, whenever this creature attacks, we get to create a 1/1 red goblin creature that it comes into tapped and is also attacking. So essentially, it's a land that produces a 3/2 goblin as well as a 1/1 token. Combine that with maybe the goblin lord. It could be a pretty decent way to get in that final bit of damage if your opponent's not expecting it. But overall, these lands are pretty cool. And I do think, blue and black have some also pretty interesting ones, but I just figured I'd kind of go over those. But these are definitely some cool lands that you may see some play, just because they have, in those maybe like slower matchups or in the late game, this is definitely something that these colors, if they're playing like monocolor style, could take advantage of. Now, the next cards I kind of want to talk about are these new enchantments that they are introducing. It almost looks like a saga, but essentially it is an enchantment that you play, and then you can level up. And these are essentially class cards that D&D has. Depending on what your style of deck is, you can pick a class that kind of fits into that style. For example, like the fighter class here, it's a white and red. You get to gain the next level as a sorcery and add its ability. So essentially, the first level when it comes into the battlefield are level 1. When fighter class enters the battlefield, we get to search our library for an equipment card. We get to reveal it. We get to put it in our hand and then shuffle. If we level it up to level 2, equip abilities we activate cost 2 less to activate. So essentially, if there's anything 2 or less, it becomes 0 to activate, which means we can equip things for free. And at level 3, we can actually, whenever a creature we control attacks, up to 1 target creature blocks it this combat if able. So essentially, you can now make a creature block that creature. So if opponent only left 1 creature to block, you can now force that creature to block a creature that maybe they didn't want to block, and it's not your biggest creature. which is definitely pretty cool overall. And there's a whole bunch of various classes, as you kind of see a couple examples here on screen. And there's also a whole bunch that are also uncommon. So depending on what style of deck, I do feel like there's gonna be a class that could probably fit into that style of deck. Like there's the blue one that essentially even just for 1 mana, for the wizard class, you for 1 mana now have no hand size for the rest of the game as long as it remains on the battlefield. And the thing is, these abilities stack on top of one another. Some of them are static abilities that kind of are like the equip ability. Some of them are when you level up to that one, you then get some sort of trigger effect. And then usually the fourth one, the third one is kind of like some big global ability that could be like the over the top ability that helps you finish out the game. Now, the last cards up that I kind of want to say that wouldn't feel Dungeons and Dragons like if we didn't have them or mention them in any sort of way are the dragons. The dragons, for the most part, are pretty impressive. There are some uncommon ones, there are some rare ones, are some mythic ones. I do think the mythic ones are overall pretty good, and I do think the black, the blue, and I think it's the white one are actually probably the better of the 5 for the mythic ones. But I do think like the mono red one, which is like a Shivian dragon on like for the most part, but just maybe a little bit better with the idea if you have a bunch of mana, you can essentially do 20 damage to any target. And the green one, I'm not 100% sold on it just yet, but overall, these cards are very powerful. The Ebon Death Dragolith is definitely be an interesting card. It's a 4 mana 5/2 flash flyer, so essentially you can play it at the end of your opponent's turn. It has flying, of course, because it's a dragon. It enters the battlefield tapped, so you can do it at the end of your opponent's turn. Goes to your turn, comes untapped, and we can cast it from our graveyard if a creature not named Ebon Death Dracolith died this turn. So at the same time too, as long as something died, you can essentially return it back. It doesn't say something you control dies. It just says something not named it dies. So it's overall pretty good card in that sense. So it definitely has some sort of regenerate style ability. I mean, it is a skeletal zombie dragon, so it not being able to come back at some point is definitely would be kind of interesting to kind of be like, wait, that doesn't make any sense for it being a zombie. And the blue one, like I said, is also pretty decent. It's a 5 mana 5/5 with fly-in. When it's untapped, it has ward 4, so your opponent has to pay 4 additional mana to actually target it with a spell, or the spell gets countered, which is definitely a great protection thing. It could become a pretty decent, just, I'll put this on the board. You have to either get through it, or you have to destroy it by paying that additional mana. Turns any 2 damage two casting cost removal into a 6 casting cost removal, or they have to play a board wiping effect. But whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, and then we have fewer than 3 cards in our hand, we actually draw cards equal to the difference. So if we draw a card, we're only at 1 card. Now we draw 2 more cards, we're back up to 3. Has this ability to kind of refill your hand. And if there was some sort of way that you could give it like vigilance, this card definitely could become some sort of thing that would be very annoying for your opponent to have to deal with. But that is just my thoughts on the whole D&D Forgotten Realms. I know there's a whole bunch of cards I didn't list. Like I said, if you guys want to leave a comment down below, maybe there's a card that I didn't list that you're looking forward to possibly playing or tinkering around with to kind of see what it does. Let me know down in the comments below. If you like this video, hit that like button. It definitely helps. If you're new here, wanted to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But that being said, I'll see you in the next video. I just wanted to give a special shout out to the channel members. If you see your name here, I definitely appreciate you. You can also become a channel member if you aren't one already by either clicking the join button next to the subscribe button below the channel, and or clicking the link in the description. It definitely helps out the channel by showing your support. But thank you, and I'll see you later in the next video.